Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another one of our Aussie aliens and unidentified aerial phenomena episodes. In this episode, we take a look at the Knowles Family encounter of 1988, also known as the Mundrabilla UFO or the Nullarbor UFO. Now, I was so excited looking into the Frederick Valentich case, coming across so many sightings. I also watched other documentaries about extraterrestrial encounters in America and different UFO sightings that they've had over there too. But in my research, I found an event that happened just 10 years after the Frederick Valentich case. Many may know the encounter as the Nullarbor UFO. It happened close to a town called Mundrabilla in WA, just short of the South Australian border. Nullarbor in Latin means nulla, no, and arbor, tree, so no trees. It has the Great Australian Bight to its south and the Great Victoria Desert to its north. The area is about 200,000 kilometres squared. Traditionally, by the first people, the area was known as Undiri, meaning the waterless, in which the first people have their story of why there was no water. Just briefly, the story begins with a water-carrying insect wanting to drop water on the area so that men would have water in that location thereafter. But due to the threat of a lizard that comes along trying to take the water, the insect quickly drops a little bit of water on the area and hurries away. But the water clearly isn't enough for the area. Europeans first came upon it when Edward John Eyre had his expedition in 1840 to 1841 to discover South Australia. He and a close friend, John Baxter, herded sheep from the Monaro area near Goulburn successfully into South Australia, and Eyre decided he wanted to see more of it and discover more of it. Sadly, although Eyre survived the trip with close Aboriginal companion Wiley, Baxter was murdered by other Aboriginal companions they had on the expedition, Yari and Joey, after a mutiny had begun due to lack of food and water. It was almost 100 years before Baxter's remains would get a proper burial and a monument established in his honour. The Irishman could finally rest. Eyre and his companion Wiley was saved only due to the fact that a French whaling ship had anchored nearby. The Trans-Australian Railway was up and running in 1917, 10 years in its creation, and some towns were set up along the way to support it. However, since it's become more automated, they haven't needed all the men to support it anymore. Like so many outback towns, there was a time they were bustling, and nowadays more like ghost towns, which are similar to those found along the Nullarbor. The interstate trains bring some tourists, but for most of the little roadhouses along the way, it's the truckies that keep them afloat, and maybe the old grey nomad or adventurer. The area has had temperatures in summer reaching 50 degrees, which only a few years ago we saw temperatures as high as 47 in Sydney. That's still bloody hot though, 50 degrees, and they get a lot more of them than Sydney gets. But it was the summer of 1988, January, just before I turned 7, enjoying our school holidays and blaring summer hits of 88 in the stereo. At the same time, a family in Perth was packing to leave for a surprise visit to relatives in Melbourne. Mrs. Faye Knowles and her 3 grown sons, Patrick, 24, Sean, 21, and Wayne, 18, along with the 2 family dogs, were all travelling in the family's 4-year-old Ford Telstar. They strapped 2 suitcases to the roof and decided to drive through the night, as it would have been much cooler during the night to travel. and they took turns driving for safety. By 4:30am the next day, they had driven 1,320 kilometres of the 3,420 kilometre trip. Sean, 21, the middle son, was now driving, and they were about 40 kilometres west of the Mundrabilla roadhouse, still in the state of WA at this stage, when ahead of them on the road were lights. Sean noticed them, but guessed they were just a truck coming the other way. But the lights seemed to be jumping around, and then all of a sudden they vanished. Then, shocking them, Patrick being in the passenger seat, the lights returned to the road, and Sean says to his brother Patrick, "Is that a spaceship?" Patrick brushed it off immediately, "Don't be silly." But they were both quite startled by what was happening. The lights got brighter and brighter, and then disappeared again, then reappeared behind them on the road, freaking them out completely. Sean hit the gas in attempt to flee away from it, but it started chasing them. The lights were then in front of them again, in the road, getting brighter. As they approached it, Sean had to drive on the wrong side of the road, narrowly missing a car towing a caravan coming the other way. Neither of the cars stopped, just kept going, until Sean slowed down and turned around. By this time, the family was well awake and scared. What was going on? Sean did turn around and went back toward the object that was pulsating with a white light. They described it as being in egg shape, in an egg cup-like thing.
Yellow sort of colour, and it had on the outsides, it was sort of shaped like that, and on the outsides it was like that, and in the centre it was like that.
It was yellow and orange in colour, with a round centre. It was pulsing, and would have been about 1 metre wide and tall enough that they could not see over it, onto the road behind it. Once again, the object disappeared, and the family took off. It popped up behind them again. Sean recalled getting up to 200 kilometres an hour, and the thing was on top of the car. The car slightly lifted off the ground, and all the occupants were well and truly freaked out, screaming. Sean blacked out at the wheel, and Faye opened her window and put her hand up to the roof. She felt something spongy and quickly withdrew her hand back into the car. The car started to fill with foul-smelling smoke. Patrick wound down his window too and heard a sound coming from the object.
All this smoke, and it was like smoke, and gases all started coming to the car, and me and my brother started to go crazy, I thought I was going in my head.
And it sounded like a humming sound. It sounded like boom, 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 and smoke started coming in the car.
Smoke started to come in the car,
probably like onions.
and that's when I just blanked out.
And he said that as they all started to talk, their voices sounded very robotic, low and strange. It felt like they were going to die.
And when it was on the roof, I wound down my window, and all this smoke started coming. It was like a greyish black mist, and that's when our voices started to change. All of us, our voices just went really deep and strange, and we felt like we were dying. I don't know. We started to sound like that, a real deep, deeper than that even. It was so deep, it's really hard to explain. More or less like our voice kind of died out as we were talking.
The egg let go of the vehicle and it hit the road. They were still going at 200 kilometres an hour. Sean woke up and hit the brakes. The tyre had blown out from the impact with the road. They momentarily lost control of the car and ended up at the side of the road in the bushes. They all got out of the car immediately and hid in the bushes for about 10 to 15 minutes before slowly approaching the car when it looked like it was all clear. They had to quickly get the tyre off and get the new spare back on. Whilst they were stopped getting the tyre on, a truck had come past them. They frantically waved at the truck, but it kept going. They changed the tyre so quickly that they left the jack in the bushes and just took off. They were going that fast that they overtook the truck that had just passed them. It wasn't the end of it though. The egg shape came back. Sean quickly turned the lights off and they were travelling along the highway in the dark. At last, the egg shape seemed to disappear and they finally made it to Mundrabilla Roadhouse. They got out of the car and were glad to see other cars and people inside the roadhouse. The first person that they walked up to and talked to was truck driver Graham Hendley, and he said he'd seen the lights too. Thank God someone else had seen it, because clearly it's not normal and beyond what most people could come to terms with. Had they not seen it for themselves? Graham had actually been on the radio with fellow truck drivers Porky and Anne when he had noticed the lights. He'd thought it was the headlights of his mates coming up in their truck behind him. It was the straight part, so it was possible he was 15 kilometres in front of them, easy. However, there was a light above these headlights, and it was going up and down and jumping about the road, just as the family had seen. The radio cut communication between him and Porky as soon as he'd seen the light, so he couldn't confirm what was going on behind him. When Porky and Anne arrived shortly after the family at the Mundrabilla Roadhouse, it was worked out that they were the ones in the truck that had driven past them while they were putting the tyre on their car, as well as the one they overtook on the way to Mundrabilla Roadhouse. It was not mentioned why they hadn't stopped, although Anne had been driving and Porky had been sleeping in the cab. Perhaps on a dark desert highway, nobody really wants to stop for anyone out there, especially crazed people on the side of the highway who'd just witnessed a UFO. That would have been pretty scary to see. The family, that is, at the time, not the UFO. The family only stayed at the roadhouse for about 30 minutes before they were on the road again. It was just enough time that Graham had to inspect the family car. He'd seen the dents on the roof, as well as the dogs cowering in the front seat. The family was very shaken up, and he recalls Faye constantly muttering, "Someone needed to do something, someone could get hurt." Back on the road, the family drove a further 210 kilometres before they were exhausted and needed to stop. After the family had gone, Porky and Graham decided to drive out to the spot that they believed the car would have stopped at. They checked the grounds to see if they could find anything that would let them know that a UFO had been there. They did find the jack that the family had used to jack the car up and change the tyres. They had already seen the blown out tyre when they met up with the family earlier, but they wanted to see if they could find anything else. They did find a skid mark on the road that coincided with them hitting the brakes, and the footprints of 4 people and paw prints from the dogs leading to the bushes from the road, and another lot of the same amount going back out to the road. So that all coincided with the story as far as they believed. Yet they couldn't find anything else on the road that would have established a UFO. And Graham really didn't know what he'd seen. But after talking amongst themselves, they decided it was best to go to the police and at least have the police interview the family, as they liked the family and they were worried about them. Shortly after this, Graham and Porky went back to their jobs. The Knowles family were interviewed further up along their route at Seduna Police Station. A Sergeant Fred Longley and Sergeant Jim Furnell spoke with the family and filed the report. Sergeant Longley said they were in a terrible state, even though it was 5 hours after the incident. Something definitely happened out there, he believed. Senior Constable Treblecock wrote An inspection of complete vehicle indicated that it appeared quite well looked after and did not display any noticeable damage consistent with having been involved in an accident or collision of any kind. I made an inspection of the damage to the roof of the vehicle, which they indicated to me as having been caused by the object when it was on their vehicle. After they were interviewed by police and crime scene forensic squad, the Ceduna police contacted Ray Brooke after their investigations to advise him, as he was part of the UFO research for South Australia, about what had happened to the Knowles family. Ray Brooke and Keith Basterfield, both highly regarded UFO researchers, led a team of 6 other investigators, including 3 from interstate. They would meet the Knowles family in Adelaide, a further 774 kilometres from where they were currently staying. Later that day, Porky and Anne arrived in Woodner and were looking for some coffee and found some, as well as buzz about everything that had gone on earlier that day. Word had got around to various news crews and television stations that someone had seen a UFO. So the news travelled faster than they did at that point. They found out where the Knowles family was staying and decided to go and see them and to talk about it with them a little further. The little town was all in a flutter. News crews and television crews and helicopters had arrived. It was probably the most interesting thing that had happened to them, probably for years, maybe even decades. They were able to have a quick conversation with the Knowles family before they were taken. Even Porky and Anne were asked for an interview, and they ended up down in Adelaide also. Channel 7 had got the exclusive rights to the story with the Knowles family, so naturally other stations, finding out about what Porky and Anne knew, wanted to interview them too. It was a busy time for everybody involved. Even Ray Brooke and Keith Basterfield were asked many questions by different news outlets. How could this be happening? What it was? Where could they be seen? And not just from the TV, radio and newspapers of Australia, but internationally now too. It had only been a day. They were poked and prodded and asked billions of questions. They were laughed at and ridiculed, as you would expect from the media.
Lights off and that's when it lost us.
Patrick, had any of you been drinking?
No way, no.
Were you tired?
I was a bit tired, yeah, but not tired enough to see a thing like that. And
Have you had any unusual feelings since it happened?
a bit sick I was.
I won't turn the lights off at night. I'm too scared to go to sleep.
Any other feelings? What about you, Wayne? How do you feel about it all?
Pretty scary, mate.
The family endured long hours of being taped and questioned until it had taken their toll on them. No one was really believing them, and those who did were harassing them.
Down the roof.
How do we know you're telling the truth?
Oh, there was even witnesses.
But a lot of people think that you are making it up. Do you realise that?
That's not true. No way.
Because 7 puts news first. Now nightly at 6.
7 puts news first.
Thank you, Channel 7. However, Ray Brooke and Keith Basterfield, the leaders of the UFO research team, had seen everything that was going on. They couldn't yet interview them, but watched most of the proceedings. They had worked out pretty quickly that the poor family were telling the truth. It was not a hoax, not that they believed anyway. In their opinion, this poor family had endured something they'll never forget. Channel 7 organised for the family car to be sent away for testing. Although the results of the testing came back, the family never saw the car again. The family arrived in Melbourne to their relatives the next day, being January 22nd. So much for the surprise. By now, I'm certain all of their family and friends knew what had happened to them. They didn't leave and arrive back in Perth for 6 weeks. What a circus it must have been for them. The vehicle analysis report in Adelaide was dated January 29th and concluded 3 shallow dents were observed on the roof of the vehicle. They were consistent with an object being pressed into the roof rather than an attempt to lift the roof. The investigation revealed that the damage to the tyre was consistent with running on a deflated tyre for an extended period. It is considered that this would account for the odour, smoke and vibration sensed during the incident. The material taken from around the front wheels was typical of residual dust from wearing brake pads and discs. No significant dust was observed on the vehicle as presented for inspection. The car was made available to the guys from the UFO research team by Channel 7. They went over the vehicle with a fine-tooth comb, paying particular attention to the tyre and the roof, as well as the dust particles. But it all failed to produce anything of special significance. The UFO team of Brook and Basterfield submitted the information about this incident to the MUFON Mutual UFO Network in America, which appeared in their March 1988 issue. Life didn't go back to normal for the Knowles family, or at least not normal for some time. They were judged and ridiculed, sadly. They lost their jobs and had no money, ended up moving out of their residence to escape the bombardment of questions and harassment from neighbours. They didn't even get their car back. They never saw it again. After it was taken by Channel 7, it was placed into storage for several months, but nobody paid the storage payments, and it was sold, put to auction in June of 1988 to recover outstanding fees. It sold for just over $7,000, none of which went to the family. The Knowles family were promised money for interviews and such, but they didn't get anything. They just wanted their life to go back to normal. They had to move in order to do this. Strangely enough, the suitcases with their clothing in it has never been found. Perhaps it was stuck to the bottom of the egg-shaped UFO and carried away and either melted or dropped somewhere else. It seems strange that they weren't dumped near the highway or obviously didn't slide off the car. Somewhere out, possibly in the Great Victoria Desert, is a suitcase with the Knowles family's clothing in it. It is believed that fishermen aboard a tuna boat also saw this light in the sky a day or two after the Knowles family had their encounter. It wasn't one tuna boat, but 2 that had seen something over the Great Australian Bight. A second tuna boat saw it a week later and reported it to the Port Lincoln Police. Chief Inspector Barry Willoughby said he could not confirm whether the sightings were linked to the bizarre story of the Perth family, who had had their car lifted on the Nullarbor plain. As well as a bus driving along the air highway near Mundrabilla. Peter Chapman, the driver for the Pioneer Express bus, said that he and his 7 passengers saw a bright light flying alongside their bus. This encounter happened late in the October of the same year. Sergeant George Johansson of the Eucla Police said that his friend Mr. Chapman was reluctant to report it at all because, probably having heard the Knowles case earlier in the year, didn't want people to think he was a Fruit Loop. But he was quite upset about it. He said it was a hair-raising experience for him. Sergeant Johansson believed his friend. Johansson stated if he reported it, it would not be a hoax. He is not one of those people who makes things up. See, it's not always crazy people coming up with crazy things. These people are your everyday Australians. Reputable people are coming forward. 7 other people on the bus saw it. It flew beside about 50 metres away and about 100 metres off the ground. He said a couple of beams of light came out and lit up the side of the bus before disappearing. And if you think that's crazy, 3 young men who were from Melbourne were travelling back to Melbourne from the countryside. The men were near Eucla when they had a sighting, a shiny object falling to the ground. as they were going by car along the road. They had a camera and started taking photos. There was an entity that emerged 50 metres away. It was frog-like from the back and semi-human from the front, wearing a green cloak hanging to just below the knees. They stated that its feet and hands looked armour-plated. Once they'd taken photos, the entity disappeared before their eyes. They raised the alarm and notified the authorities when they got back to Melbourne. It was said that some men came to observe the cameras. The cameras were taken from them, and they never got to see the photos and never saw their cameras again. Talk about a cover-up. It's amazing how many sightings there were in Australia in the 1950s, and we'll get to that in a later episode. Sadly, nothing ever became of the story. It's just a legend now. There was no way of getting any further evidence. Although people have said they've seen this egg-shaped UFO in different areas in different states, even in New South Wales over the Blue Mountains. A man contacted UFO researcher Rex Gilroy to advise him he'd had the same thing happen to them. In a car with 4 people in June of 2000, a huge object suddenly appeared above the car. As they were driving toward Bilpin from Bell early one morning, the occupants of the car saw an ionized blue glow which enveloped the car. They were terrified but continued to drive on. They felt their vehicle being lifted off the road by at least 2 feet or 61 centimetres, and after being carried for some few hundred feet, the glow vanished and the vehicle hit the road. It was a similar instance for the Knowles family. Something out there is picking up and lifting cars off the road. And it also happened in 1993, where a Ken Smith of Yass was stopping for a meal break on a trip from Gulgong to Gunning in central New South Wales. He said, "As I sat there on the deserted road, I heard a sound like wires scratching against metal. Then I felt something grip the rear of the car and lift it up. I could see nothing through the rear window, but something, whatever it was, lifted the car's rear 4 times before dropping it back on the road. I backed out of there and drove away as fast as I could." Further along on his trip, Ken saw a bright green object about the size of a fox's eye, hovering about 45 centimetres or 18 inches off the ground, shining brilliantly in the darkness. As I drove, it kept moving to the left of the car. I felt enormous relief several k's down the road when the light abruptly vanished. I've never been able to shake the memory or my conviction that the green light was somehow connected to the lifting and dropping of my car. How spooky. And although it was 1988, 1993 and 2000, it's probably still happening there, out in the middle of Whoop Whoop, which is pretty much where it seems to be happening, out in the middle of nowhere, on long deserted highways. It's interesting to think that something out there is mucking around with our people. Whether it's, once again, experimental aircraft, perhaps whoever's controlling this, be it human or extraterrestrial, is mucking about. I don't know particularly if they're trying to take a vehicle off the road, possibly abduct them using different type of aircraft, and perhaps it's not strong enough to lift these cars. Maybe they're going away and doing a little bit more research, coming back and trying to take another car. And you know what? Perhaps they succeeded. Maybe that's why we haven't heard any more of these stories since 2000. Maybe they've been so successful they took the occupants. So as sad as things were after the Knowles family had their ordeal At least they all survived. What's happened to people who haven't, or they've been taken? Or perhaps even people have been taken and they don't remember. It is well and truly freaky. But that was the Mundrabilla or Nullarbor UFO story of the Knowles family. It goes to show you how crazy things can get. Not just as traumatic as the episode of the encounter was, but then the ridicule and things that happen afterwards. I think it's going to come to a time where we can't be that naive anymore. But maybe it's a little while off yet. If you enjoyed this episode though, definitely give it a like. Subscribe if you haven't already and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more freaky UFO, extraterrestrial and alien stories. Stay tuned.
Terrified members of the Knowles family claimed a bright flying object sucked their car off the ground.
It was early yesterday morning when the Knowles family had their close encounter on the Nullarbor plain. About halfway between Melbourne and Perth, their blue Ford Telstar was chased by what they told police was an extremely bright white light. The egg-shaped object hovered above the car, lifting it more than a metre off the ground. Police at Ceduna in South Australia were today at a loss to explain the sighting. Samples of ash taken from the Knowles car have been sent to police forensic scientists for study. So far the results of those tests are unknown.
A Perth family claims it's been confronted by a UFO while crossing the Nullarbor. Their story's been backed by other motorists, and the crew of 2 South Australian fishing boats have also reported being buzzed by a UFO. Faye Knowles and her 3 sons claim an orange blob picked their car up off the highway. They fled in terror into the scrub until the object disappeared.
For the Knowles family, it was to have been a routine drive across the Nullarbor. That all changed as the family approached the town of Mundrabilla on the air highway. They claim that's when they had their unexpected and terrifying encounter with the unknown.
The car was shaking. I went down the window and I said it's on top of the roof. And all this, I don't know what it was, it all come inside the car like smoke. We thought we were all dead.
Another motorist and a truck driver also witnessed the incident. They confirm the Knowles family story. Police are investigating the claim. They say the car did have dents on the roof and an ash substance inside. Late today, the Knowles family returned to the scene of their experience